So, Tom, we have some unbelievably exciting news for our listeners, don't we?
We absolutely do, Dominic. The England cricket team will not be the only group of Englishmen touring Australia this coming summer to triumphant effect, because we will be as well. We're coming to Australia in November and December this year, and you can get tickets at therestishistory.com.
So, listen, we will be undertaking 4 tests, 4 shows in front of our beloved Australian audience, our very favourite audience, I think, Tom. And we'll be doing shows at the Sydney Opera House in Melbourne, and then we'll be doing 2 more at the start of December in Adelaide and in Brisbane.
And we will be talking about one of Australia's greatest exports and the impact that it has had on the understanding of history across the world and through time.
So tickets are on sale now for our beloved members of the Rest is History Club. And if you want to snap those tickets up early, you should join the Rest is History Club at therestishistory.com.
And tickets will be available to purchase for everyone else from this Thursday, that's the 3rd of July, at 11 a.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time.
So, for your chance to see us live on stage in an Australian city near you, head to therestishistory.com, join the club and get your tickets.
The Freeman's Journal, 22nd of November 1920. Where will it end? Yesterday morning, some 14 officers and men of the military and secret services were shot dead at the same hour in widely separated districts of the city, some in hotels, some in private residences. In the afternoon, the authorised answer of the government agents came in the form of an attack upon a football crowd assembled, unsuspecting of evil, to watch a match in Croke Park. Croke Park was turned into Amritsar, with the difference that there were no proclamations, no warnings, no legalities defied by the assembly in Croke Park. The slaughter was a classic example of a government reprisal. The innocent were shot down in blind vengeance. The pretense that the firing was provoked by an attack upon the government forces will deceive no one in Ireland. It is another base official lie.
So strong words there from the Freeman's Journal, published on the 22nd of November 1920. And the Freeman's Journal had long been Ireland's leading constitutional nationalist newspaper, so backing home rule rather than independence. But there you can sense shock, outrage, and the sense of a newspaper perhaps changing its mind. And the reason for that are the events in Dublin of the previous day that the newspaper is describing. And it is a Sunday that has gone down in history as Ireland's first Bloody Sunday. So it's probably the single most notorious moment in the war for Irish independence that had begun almost 2 years earlier. And that is largely because of what happened where we are sitting right now at Croke Park. And if you can hear the humming of a lawnmower behind us tending the sacred turf, that is because we are at this great shrine of Irish sport. But Dominic, before we get on to the terrible events of Bloody Sunday, should we just remind ourselves of where we've got to in the story of the war for Irish independence?
Sure. Listeners will remember that last time, in the last episode, we began with Sinn Féin's landslide election victory in December 1918, and then we looked at what happened over the next 2 years. The creation of a Republican counter-state with its own courts, its own local officials, the growth of the Irish Volunteers, which became the Irish Republican Army, which is determined to fight for an independent republic, a growing guerrilla campaign, increasingly bloody, against the British authorities, reprisals by British troops, by the Royal Irish Constabulary, and most famously the Black and Tans and the Auxiliaries. So we reached November 1920. And to guide us through the story of what happened next, what happened here at Croke Park on that day, we have somebody who's no stranger to this stadium, historian of University College Dublin, national treasure and self-declared pound shop Bono, Paul Rouse. And Paul, you're actually a historian by training of Irish sport and the interaction of Irish sport and politics and nationalism and so on. So this story has a real resonance for you, doesn't it?
It's an extraordinary story and an extraordinary day. It begins in the morning with the IRA killing a group of 14 or 15 agents of the British state, largely, though not entirely, as we will see. In the afternoon, there was Croke Park here. In the evening, there are further murders, and the murders aren't just based in Dublin, because there are random killings, random acts of violence around the country, including a policeman who was going home from Mass in a country town in Watford who was shot dead while chatting to a grocer's daughter. And for their part, the British Army shot civilians in Meath and in Mayo while there was a civilian killed while Dublin was under curfew. So this is death in an Irish sense on a large scale. The numbers on the day barely reach 40 dead, which in comparison to other conflicts and other times will not seem enormous.
So in that newspaper report, there was a comparison to the massacre at Amritsar in India in the same year where there were hundreds killed. It's not on that scale, is it?
It's not of that scale of number, but it's the nature of the events on the day that are truly shocking. They've left a legacy, which I think we should talk about later on as well, the legacy and how it wound through history afterwards, precisely because it was also an intersection of sport and politics.
Right. So take us through the day. Let's go through it in some detail. And let's start with, dawn breaks Sunday morning, the 21st of November, and the IRA have a long drawn up plan, don't they? An elimination plan, basically death squads going out into the city.
So the short answer to what happened early in the morning of the 21st of November is that at around 9 a.m, about 100 IRA men, led by the Dublin Brigade of the IRA, targeted 19 men at 8 locations around Dublin. Now, before I came in earlier to meet you in the academy, I walked the streets where those men were based. And it's all in quite a condensed area in the south inner city, with the exception of one set of killings which took place in the Gresham Hotel opposite the General Post Office where we were the last time you were over. So 19 men at 8 locations were targeted. 15 of those men were shot dead. 4 others were injured. A group of other men, an unknown number of other men, escaped all injury in what happened. The men who were shot had been identified in intelligence put together by a special unit of the IRA known as the Squad, which Michael Collins had established in 1919, and the idea was that it would combat the activities of the G Division of the Dublin Metropolitan Police. So that was the intelligence unit and the detectives of the Dublin Metropolitan Police. Their men, those G men, their job was to collect evidence against people who were perceived to be the enemies of the state. Now, among the squad were some of Collins' squad, were some of the Tipperary men who we met right back in the earlier episode, who are now in Dublin as full-time soldiers of the IRA.
So are these killings personally ordered or sanctioned by Michael Collins himself?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So talk us through how it works. So there's a good example, isn't there? That one of the killers, a guy called Stapleton, arrives.
William Stapleton,
arrives at Bagot Street, is it 92 Lower Bagot Street, where a guy called Captain W.F. Newbury, who's been designated as a target. So what happens there?
Stapleton and a couple of people who were with him, a couple of men who were with him, broke into Captain Newbury's flat. He was in his pajamas, in bed with his wife Hetty, who was over visiting from England. And he tried to escape out a window with Hetty trying to protect him and turn the killers out. He was shot 7 times and he ended up hanging from the window from which he was trying to escape. Captain Newbury's wife was, according to William Stapleton, left in a terrified and hysterical condition. It took about 15 minutes for him to die, all the while he was hanging from the window, while she covered him in a blanket. The brilliant Trinity historian Anne Dolan, who, along with people like Jane Leonard, David Leeson and Michael Foley, have written great work on this day. But Anne Dolan writes that Mrs. Newbury was haunted by the sound of shooting, of gunmen laughing, by the memory of a man washing her husband's blood off his hands in her own sink.
Oh my God.
And had Captain Newbury been a secret agent?
Yes, it appears so.
And so what is the reputation of the British Secret Service at this point? Because you've been talking about how useless all the various departments of the British state in Ireland are. Do they have a formidable reputation among the IRA? And if so, is it deserved?
One of the singular truths of Irish history is that Irish nationalist and Republican organisations were repeatedly riddled with informers who fed information through various intelligence units and passed them to Dublin Castle. This evidence was not always convincing. Often it was speculative. Sometimes it was information that was clearly made up by people who wished to impress their handlers and get money. We know all this from spy organisations around the world. I think the issue was what happened with the information when it went to Dublin Castle. But yes, this was an intelligence war of huge proportions, and it mattered to the British state that the intelligence collected was used properly. It mattered that it was well collected. And the problem for British intelligence was that they themselves were infiltrated by the IRA, who were feeding information on a loop back to Collins.
Let's talk a bit about the people who were shot. So in the sort of IRA version of events, these are a notorious gang, the Cairo gang, I think they're called, of ruthless British secret agents who had to be eliminated for the survival of the Irish Revolution. First of all, not all of the men who are killed are intelligence officers. And secondly, remarkably, not all of them are English. So first of all, not all of them are intelligence officers. So are some people killed in error? Is that how this...
Yes. So I think we'll break them down into different categories. There were intelligence officers who were killed. In the shorthand of the Irish Revolution and in the Irish popular mind, it's remembered that Collins had 14 spies shot.
Yeah.
And the truth of it is that's just not correct. So some were intelligence officers, including, for example, Henry Anglish, who used the alias name of MacMahon while he was in Dublin. He was actually in bed with Joseph Connolly, also an intelligence agent who was from Wexford and had been to UCD when they were attacked by IRA men. There was also a man called Ascham Ames. On the day after he was shot, the New York Times actually carried the notice of his engagement to a New York socialite, Millicent Ewing. And a day later, again, it printed his death notice. There were spies there, but there were also a mixture of, say, court-martial officials, of staff officers and of ordinary police recruits.
Right.
And a great example, I think, is Jack Fitzgerald, John Joseph, but known as Jack Fitzgerald, who was a recent police recruit who came actually from a well-known Gaelic Athletic Association family in Tipperary. His father was either patron or president of the local GAA club. He was the fifth of 11 children in the classic cliched Irish family. His mother had died young. He had been sent to Blackrock College, again, the place where De Valera went. He joined the British Army in 1915 when he was 16 years of age, as many people in Ireland of his generation did. He was with the 16th Division, who fought at Ganshi and was part of the fight that went on there. In 1917, he joined the Royal Flying Corps. His plane crashed. He was captured. He was kept as a POW. He then escaped. He was then recaptured. He was demobilised in 1919 and he was joining the colonial police to go and serve the British Empire or in the forces of empire around the world. He was due to go overseas actually 2 weeks later on the 5th of December, and he was shot in his bed. You're right that not all of the people who shot were even connected with the British services. An example is one of the houses where men were killed was on Morehampton Road, 117 Morehampton Road, and one of the intelligence officers there, people who thought was an intelligence officer, was actually a landlord. It was his house, and he was shot. And another was a kind of a fascinating man called Paddy McCormack, who was from Mayo. He'd gone to Castleknock College, an elite public school on the north side of Dublin. He was a professional jockey after he left school and had won races around Ireland, and then became a trainer and a vet, qualified as a vet. He joined the Army Vet Corps in 1917, won races. So he was based in the Curragh, based in Egypt. And after the war, he applied for and won a job to run horse racing in Cairo, which God. He was about to go across to do.
And Paul, can I ask, the Cairo set is a name that is given to this grouping of agents and people who are shot, isn't it?
Yes. There was a coffee shop on Grafton Street,
where the Secret Service agents are meeting.
But I mean, loads of people went there. It was one of those things, and there was this rumor that it was about people who'd been hardened in the colonial service away in Cairo. But it's actually
it's nothing to do with this guy horse racing in Cairo.
No, nothing to do with him. But he was a trainer of horses, and the great Irish trainer J.J. Parkinson, he was involved with him. So McCormack was actually staying in the Gresham Hotel. He was an incredible character. It's not quite clear where he got his lifestyle from, but he used to rise only in the late afternoon, unless there was horse racing. He might get up slightly earlier.
So like Theo. Very like Theo.
Yeah. He's smiling weakly.
He was a man who was fond, I think, of, maybe this is Theo as well, like fond of lavish entertainment.
That's definitely Theo.
He was due to head to Cairo with his wife and his daughter on the 2nd of December. His daughter was 4. Her name was Grace, and he was shot and died in a pool of blood in a bedroom in the Gresham Hotel.
A bad day for people involved in sport, all round.
In this case, a simple fact that it gives a lie to the idea that it was 15 spies who were shot.
But that's the myth, isn't it? That passes into the bloodstream of the mythology of the Irish Revolution. It's
the way the legacy of war works, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit.
So Michael Collins has this extraordinary passage where he says his plan was the destruction of the undesirables who made miserable the lives of ordinary decent citizens. If I had a second motive, it was no more than a feeling such as I would have for a dangerous reptile. By their destruction, the very air is made sweeter. And he went on to say there's no crime in detecting or destroying in wartime the spy and the informer. I've paid them back in their own coin. And that's the language that we're very familiar with from all kinds of kind of paramilitary conflicts and so on, I guess. But that's gone down in, I guess, nationalist mythology, that it's a kind of a cleansing, that it's, the making the air sweeter and whatnot.
And there was a failure to properly recognise afterwards that among those killed was civilians such as McCormick. McCormick's family didn't leave a go. They kept at it to say that this is heaping calumny on a man who you've killed. He was no spy.
Yeah. So the men who were doing the killing, interestingly, so you mentioned Anne Dolan in her article, and she looks at actually the people who carried out the killings. And there's a description of the gunmen laughing and the bloke washing their hands in the sink. But some of them are kind of traumatized by having done the killings. Is that right?
Oh, deeply traumatized. We were talking about this earlier, the mythology that wraps itself around every conflict and made real in the ballads that we were talking about earlier, where it's about people romanticizing dying for Ireland. But it's quite difficult to romanticize killing another human being.
Particularly if they're hanging out of windows with their wife sobbing.
It's not an attractive proposition. It is not the stuff which mythologies are constructed around. And I mentioned Anne Dolan earlier on her article, Killing on Bloody Sunday, November 1920. And she looked at the impact of the lives. Part of the thing was to look at the impact of the lives. And some of the men who carried out shootings on that day were utterly traumatized. They ended up in nervous breakdowns, in habitual drunkenness, or in general collapse of health in all of this. I'll give you an example. James Norton, another historian, Mark Duncan, has recorded that James Norton said that he was personally responsible for the shooting of 3 British intelligence officers, 2 of whom were killed and 1 seriously injured or wounded in the presence of their screaming wives and children. After Bloody Sunday, Norton said that there had been a gradual deterioration in his condition until he had complete mental breakdown in July 1921, and he couldn't cope with what he had done, and he spent a lot of his life in Grangegorman Mental Hospital, as it was then called, just down the road from us here in the north side of Dublin. Anne Dolan, I think, put it brilliantly. She said, killing a spy may have been an order or a duty, but there was much to reconcile when all you saw was a man in his pyjamas clinging to his wife. And interestingly, I think as well, Norton in Grangegorman shared that hospital with men who had fought in the British Army in the Great War.
Wow.
They themselves traumatized.
And Paul, is the implication of this that even after 2 years, the actual habit of killing is upsetting and traumatizing for people? And that to that extent, the habits of normality, of civilian life, of peace, haven't completely broken down?
Yeah, and I think it's also about the nature of the war here, where someone might only fire a gun. That might have been his first time to fire a gun, or many of these, their first time to fire a gun. First of all, it was very hard to get guns. Second of all, they were used only in certain places at certain times. The habitual usage is very difficult to deliver.
And talking of the habits of normality, those rhythms of daily life are carrying on in the city of Dublin the day of the shooting. And so, for instance, you have sports fixtures, they are still going ahead.
Yeah, and that's the thing about it is the killings on the morning of Bloody Sunday were only the start of things. That day, Tipperary is a county more famous for hurling than for Gaelic football, but they had a brilliant Gaelic football team in 1920, and a challenge match was set up between Dublin and Tipperary to be played here in Croke Park. And it was as if, as you say, Tom, the morning had never happened. People were coming across the city to this place as if this was not a city at war. And of course, partly because for a lot of people, it wasn't really a city at war. There was actually 2 games here that day. The first was a local club match. And while that was taking place, there was a meeting of GAA administrators in the ground. The Gaelic Athletic Association, shortened to GAA, the organisation who runs these games. They were making policy for the coming months. And officers of the Dublin Brigade of the IRA came to the stadium and they advised that the match should be called off.
Right.
That this was dangerous. They had heard whispers that the British forces would be coming to Croke Park and to look for people. The GAA official said the match will go ahead. If it weren't to go ahead, it would be like us saying that we were somehow complicit in what happened in the morning. And also there was a large crowd inside the ground already who had paid money, and that itself can create an issue. So the Styles had opened just after 2 p.m. The stewards were in place. The ticket sellers were on the roads that we came through on the way here. When we walked around the stadium, down the lanes and in the roads, were people out selling tickets for people to come into the game. And they reckon that by the time the ball was thrown in to start the match at 3:15, there were about 5,000 people here, and the proceeds of those 5,000 people here were to go to the Republicans.
And what would the capacity have been then?
It could hold more or less 12 to 15,000. Sometimes it says it could go more than that and go up to
about half full, just
but
under
30
half
to 35. It's not. It wasn't intensely packed by any means.
So we have an account of what happened from a guy called Jack Sholdis. He'd won the All-Ireland Football Championship at Dublin and now is an IRA man. And he's also a leading GAA official. And he tells this story that the match starts and then an aeroplane flies over the ground and there's some kind of signal that comes from the plane, or the plane is spotting or something. So what's the story of the plane?
So again, this is one of those tangled webs where people are saying, oh, it was to send a signal to say the game had started and you can go in now and you can halt things and you can search people and make them leave. But again, it's hard sometimes to separate the myth from the history here in all of this. That there was a plane, we know that it was scouting, we know, but precisely how that scouting was used is not entirely clear. What we do know is that 15 minutes after the match started, that is to say at 3:30, the lorries and regiments of the British Army and of the local police arrived to the ground, and they began firing on people from outside the stadium.
Right. What have they come for? Is it because they think the killers are in the crowd, or that there are people in the crowd who are smuggling weapons, or what's their rationale?
It was clear in the mind of the administration that the Gaelic Athletic Association was allied with the nationalist movement, and that the nationalist movement and its games were used as a cloak for Republican activities. This was overdone as an argument, but it wasn't entirely baseless in its notion. And there were people in the ground who'd been involved in what happened earlier that day.
Oh, right. Okay.
But not with guns and markers that would have identified them.
So
as such,
this is
presumably.
it. This is it. The British forces, how could they be firing on a football match is really your basic question. Yeah. How do we get to that point? Well, what had happened was, in the kind of the minutes and then the hours after the morning assassinations, there was utter revulsion and fear, no doubt, as well, and shock and rage amongst the officials who ran the British state and amongst the security forces. They had lost friends and they'd lost key operatives. And the desire was seen to be to respond, to be seen to act immediately, and that was considered to be paramount. They knew the match was taking place, and they did believe that the match was used to pass people in and out of Dublin. And I've mentioned already about the role of Tipperary in all of this and the fact that it was them added to stuff. So an order was issued from Dublin Castle which permitted a raid on these grounds for men in arms. So the loose plan was to approach Croke Park from 3 different directions. Now, you can see the magnificent stadium that's here now holds almost 83,000 people. But what you had at that stage was a much smaller ground with a row of houses around it. Those laneways that we walked through earlier, they were more in keeping with the height of the houses behind that. So it was built into the environment of the city rather than standing out from that environment in how it was done. So the plan was to come from 3 different directions. The first group of military personnel were to come down Russell Street, where we drove down earlier, past the modern Gills pub, and to stop at the bridge on Jones's Road, basically at the corner of what is now the Hogan stand and the Davin stand. The force that came here was a combination of RIC men and black and tans. That is to say, the police and their support, the black and tans, who had come in, commanded by Major E.J. Mills. And they were to take control of the entrance at the canal end here. The second group were soldiers from the Duke of Wellington's regiment, who were commanded by Lieutenant Robert Bray. And they took a position at the opposite end of the ground, though along the same side of the road, at another entrance, behind what is now the modern Nally Terrace. And a third group of soldiers came right behind us here to the third and last exit and entrance into the ground. They were to block that gate, which opened out onto St. James's Avenue. So in theory, all the gates into Croke Park were now closed off, and everyone in the ground could be searched as they left. And whatever guns were supposed to be there could then be taken, and the men with them.
So how do you get from that, which is, I can understand how that works. They're going to wait outside the ground for people to leave and then search them on their way out. How do you get from that so quickly to them actually drawing their own guns and opening fire?
So instead of a stop and search operation, what you had basically was the killing of innocent men, women, a woman and children. So as members of that first group I talked about, the police and the black and tans, reached the bridge on Jones's Road, several of them, for reasons which remain inexplicable beyond the general environmental stuff of the morning and what we've said earlier, they began firing from the bridge, from outside the ground.
The report in the Freeman's Journal, which we opened this with, said that the firing was provoked by an attack upon the government forces. And this is dismissed outright as not being true. I mean, do we know? How do we know that? Maybe there were.
We'll come back to this afterwards, but there is not one shred of evidence has been produced that the first shots came from inside. Nothing compelling. There has been claim and counterclaim. But you'll see when we talk about the inquiries afterwards, the evidence that sits in the opposite direction. There was a high wall running at the back of the terrace here, beside where the bridge where the firing started from. And it's across that wall and into the trees that were on this side of the ground. And this notion of boys and girls sitting in trees and watching sports, you know, is
jumpers for goalposts.
Yeah, it's part of a very particular type of world. So there was an 11-year-old boy, William Robinson, sitting in one of those trees, and he was shot and died instantly as he fell from the tree. A second boy was sitting on the back of a wall just down from Jerome O'Leary. He was 10 years of age, and he was killed by a bullet that went through his head while he was sitting on that wall, and again was knocked off it. Shortly afterwards, a third boy, Billy Scott, was killed at the far end of the ground here. In that lane that we walked through between Croke Park and the railway, there was a gate out, and a bullet ricocheted and killed him there. So the police and the black and tans from that corner of the bridge came into the ground and kept firing.
And at that point, you might think, well, it will stop. They'll realise the horror of what they've done. But actually, they continue firing. And now, obviously, there's bedlam in the crowd and people are screaming and rushing everywhere. And you get a bit of a crush and a stampede, understandably. And it's a kind of, an absolutely hellish scene.
It's a hellish scene. And there's chaos, confusion, people running in everywhere, and soldiers at the other end can hear firing coming from one end. They come in and they set up and they start firing. And all around the place, there's people running for cover, people diving on the ground, people transfixed by the fear of the moment.
Paul, one of those men was wearing the coat that is beside you right now. For those who are watching on the video, for those who aren't, it's a coat with a hole that has been sewn back on, and that hole is where the bullet went in.
Yeah, so this is the coat of Tom Hogan, who was along with James Matthews, a spectator who was at the game, and they were shot dead as they tried to run. As always happens in these situations, as people, or as you can imagine which will happen in these situations, as people run for cover with gunfire coming from different directions, echoing around the pitch, bullets, flying here and there. There was a stampede and a crush to get out, and people were left lying dead or dying on the ground and lying injured. And Jack Shouldes, you mentioned him earlier, he said that the greatest crush was on this side of the ground where we are now, the Ballybach side, where hundreds were wounded or injured in the mad scramble that followed, or trampled and torn with barbed wire on the walls, trying to get out. The barbed wire put up to stop people getting in for free now stops people getting out for fear of life. And you have people like Jane Boyle shot and crushed in the crowd. James Tehan and James Burke crushed again. Daniel Carroll gets out of the ground but is shot with a ricocheted bullet, and he died from his wounds in a house outside the ground. And all the while there were still people trapped in here, still trapped, unable to get out. Jack Shoulders remembered that, there were rifles and machine guns trained on people after the shooting had stopped, but corralling them in and kept there for more than an hour, searched as they went out of the place.
All right. Well, let's take a break now, and then we'll come back and we will talk about some of the people who were killed. We'll talk about the aftermath of the shooting, and we'll talk about how this plays out with the rest of the War of Independence and how we get from here to the Anglo-Irish Treaty. So come back after the break.
This episode is brought to you by Rocket Money.
Tom, we often talk about how to organise our finances. I'm very conscious that I'm paying for a lot of mad subscriptions. And there's one thing that we've talked about often on this show. It's the thing that we probably hate more than any other, and it's a hidden fee. I would love to get my finances under control. There are all these things piling up on our bank statements, and I think I need to fix this problem. I need to sort this out and to stop this.
I mean, my finances are so chaotic that I need this app.
So I'll tell you what it is. It's called Rocket Money. It's a personal finance app that helps find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions. It monitors your spending, and it helps to lower your bills so that you can grow your savings.
With Rocket Money, you can track all of your subscriptions, and you can easily cancel within the app with just a few taps, saving you time, avoiding charges. And you can also set budgets and goals and get personalized insights and regular reports to track how you're doing. They will even send you real-time alerts for large transactions, upcoming bills, refunds, and even low balances. So let Rocket Money help you reach your financial goals faster. Join at rocketmoney.com/ishistory.
That's rocketmoney.com/ishistory. rocketmoney.com/ishistory.
Welcome back to The Rest is History. Paul, you've described in harrowing detail some of these scenes at Croke Park. Obviously, eventually the ground empties, and we'll come back to the inquiries and the cover-up and the way that the authorities try to justify what's happened. A couple of things that you think are important. So one of them is that the events of the afternoon and the events of the morning are inextricably linked.
Entirely.
So what happened in the afternoon is very clearly a response to what happened in the morning.
It's in the manner of the reprisals.
Right.
Though a very extreme version of the reprisals, which were now becoming common.
So the reprisals have almost become institutionalized.
Yes.
The authorities will make reprisals after as they see every provocation.
Yeah, normally it's localized. It's never on this scale. Apart from, you could say, the burning of Cork was the closest you could get to this.
And the second thing is, it's often described as deliberate and cold-blooded. Is it cold-blooded, or is it in the heat of the moment, as it were? In other words, do they know exactly what they're doing, the people who are shooting those guns, or are they out of control and they've lost discipline and they've lost reason?
I think they've lost reason. I think they're entirely out of control. I think it's a product, though, of the perceptions that the soldiers and that the officials held of Irish people and of the nature of the war that was underway. I don't think it's cold-blooded. I think it's hot-blooded.
Right. Okay. You talked about some of the people that died that day, but one person you didn't mention, Michael Hogan. He's a player who dies, and he was from
Tipperary, Grange Muckler in South Tipperary.
Right.
He was the only player killed. He was killed crawling off the pitch down in front of Hill 16. He'd been playing on a famous Dublin footballer called Frank Burke, who managed to get off the field.
And one of the stands here is named after him.
Yeah, the stand across from us is called after Michael Hogan. His brother Dan was a leading member of the IRA in the Monaghan area, which is up near the border now. And Michael himself was the IRA company commander in the Grange Muckler area, where he worked on the family farm. There is no sense, by the way, that he was targeted to be killed because of who he was. It's one of those things. But there was other people. I think, in fairness, Hogan's remembered because he was the player that was killed. But like, you look at, say, Michael Feary. I think Michael Feary is a brilliant example. Michael Feary was 40. He was a labourer who lived in the slums behind us here in Buckingham Street in the North Inner City. He actually made it out of Croke Park having been shot, but he was bleeding so badly that he died out on Russell Street. His body lay unclaimed in a morgue for 5 days. The British Army officer who identified him noted that a number of his teeth were missing and that he was badly malnourished. He also noticed that he was wearing army fatigues and old, worn-down army boots. And that's because Michael Feary, like many other people, had fought in the British Army in the Great War. And by 1920, in November 1920, he was really struggling, was unemployed.
Right.
So this is a whole span of people who went, okay, Hogan is famous for being the player who was shot, but Michael Feary's life is worth as much as Michael Hogan's.
Yeah, of course.
And the death at Croke Park is not the end of the killings on Bloody Sunday.
No, it isn't. Dublin Castle, two veterans of the 1916 Rising and men who were hugely important within the IRA, Pater Clancy and Richard McKee, who'd been arrested the previous night and who were involved in the planning of the Bloody Sunday, the earlier killings in the day, were shot along with a man called Conor Clune. So Conor Clune was an Irish language activist and a co-op manager from County Clare who had nothing to do with the revolution. He also had been arrested the night before in a case of mistaken identity or really poor evidence. Now, it's contested what's happened here. In the official version of events, the three men were trying to escape. Now, where that breaks down is Clune had no reason to escape. Apart from anything else, it said the three of them were trying to escape around 11 o'clock that night and were shot dead. The generally accepted version is that the three of them had been beaten and were shot, basically summarily executed. For the Dublin IRA, it should be said the loss of McKee and Clancy was really significant, and one of their number said that it knocked all the good out of it.
Because it's often said that actually that was more damaging to Michael Collins's intelligence network than the agents who were killed by his agents.
Yeah, and it was a bitter blow, and it says a lot for the status of those two men within the IRA that two army barracks in independent Ireland were called after them, Clancy Barracks and McKee Barracks, when Ireland attained independence.
So, Paul, the consequences of this, there is a very striking response on the other side of the Irish Sea the next morning when the docks at Liverpool are torched. And we should probably just mention at this point that the war isn't confined to Ireland, that there are IRA operatives in England. You know, they're doing industrial sabotage. There's a plot to poison the horses of the household cavalry to try and stop the state opening of Parliament. But there is a very striking attack that happens 3 months later when IRA volunteers in Manchester are caught trying to burn down Old Trafford, so the football ground of Manchester United. And they do actually burn down a stand at the ground of Manchester City. So maybe there's a targeted sporting reprisal there.
I'm not sure if those are absolutely tied together.
There is blowback in England. And I guess also a huge part of the blowback is that liberal opinion there is massively shocked. I mean, of course, there's absolute outrage in Ireland, but there is also, people are appalled in England too.
There is an outcry in England, and the claims that were made, and it shows you the nature of the outcry that Sir Hammer Greenwood, the Chief Secretary of Ireland, that is to say the most important British official in the country, told the House of Commons, stood up in the House of Commons and said that the first shots came from inside the ground, that 30 revolvers had been found in the ground afterwards, that the shots fired in the ground had caused a stampede, that it was in the stampede that people had lost their lives.
And that these are barefaced lies, are they?
Oh, straight up. It's a clear cover-up. And more than that, he said that the British forces had opened fire because they were fired on by gunmen who were trying to escape. Again, he said he deeply regretted the loss of life, but this loss of life was entirely the responsibility of Irish gunmen. And in the way of these things, there were conservative newspapers in Britain who took this story and ran with it.
What did the Guardian say?
The Guardian regarded it as nonsense, and the British Labour Party sent over a commission to investigate what happened, and the report of the commission found no evidence that the police had been fired on and condemned instead the calculated brutality and lack of self-control of the police force. And for the next 67 years, further evidence collected by the military and through courts of inquiry were kept from the public. But the historian David Leeson wrote brilliantly on this. He said in November 1999, the Public Records Office in London released 3 documents. The first was a report submitted by Major Mills on the day after Bloody Sunday. The second was a military court of inquiry at the Mater Hospital. And the third was a military court of inquiry at Jervis Street Hospital. I don't think there's any need to rehearse here the full details of these kind of 3 sources, except to say, in the round, they demonstrate that the official version of events was a nonsense. And Mills wrote that no arms had been found on the ground in searches of people. And the military court of inquiry made clear there was no gun battle.
So before, in the last sort of 15 minutes or so of the episode, before we get into the story of the war and how the war sort of winds its way to its conclusion, just to wrap up what happened here at Croke Park, it becomes this absolutely foundational moment in modern Irish history, doesn't it? I mean, it takes on this extraordinary significance for Irish nationalism, for sport in Ireland, for the GAA. Those of us who follow kind of British and Irish sport will remember the scenes when the England rugby team played here about, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, whenever it was, for the first time. And this sort of day that was freighted with emotion. So what did Bloody Sunday come to mean? Well, not least for the GAA, for the Gaelic Athletic Association.
I will come back to that in a second, but I have a real problem with this idea of how it is presented within history. And for me, the real meaning of Bloody Sunday it doesn't lie in grand historical narratives, but it lies in the personal pain and the trauma of those who were bereaved. Like, how did Jerome O'Leary cope with the death of his young son, who was also called Jerome? He had to go to the Mater Hospital and identify his son, and he simply said he was a schoolboy. How did Bridget Robinson cope with having to go on a Sunday evening from her house on Little Britain Street across to the old Drumcondra Hotel where her young son, William, 11, lay? A bullet had ripped his chest to pieces. He fought to survive and lasted for hour after hour before he died. Bridget Robinson was 29 when she did that. How did her husband cope? Her husband's name was Patrick. He had been in that hospital as a surgeon sought to save his son's life. How did James Boyle cope with the loss of his sister Jane, who was 26? And Annie Burke came in from Windy Arbour to testify about the loss of her husband. And she just said, he left on a Sunday morning to see a football match. It was 2:00. And that's it. So they're united with the family of Paddy McCormick and all of those other people who were dead, whose body laid in blood across this city in two different parts of the day, and again later that evening in Dublin Castle. And that's the real, like, people talk about blood sacrifice, but that's the real legacy in the blood of the families that were shed and could never be recovered.
And Paul, that line, he left on Sunday morning to see the football match, it was 2:00. The horror of it is massively amplified by the fact that it is a leisure activity, that it should properly be a kind of safe space away from the horrors of the war.
And that's why the story has such resonance, and it transforms an understanding as well of the sheer brutality of this conflict. And what it does, I think, in general, is that it shows you the descent into brutality that was well underway by November 1920. So within a week, you have the Kilmichael ambush near Macroom, where Tom Barry and
so
his
we
West
mentioned
Cork.
him, didn't we?
Yeah, so
and
Tom Barry, and a former British.
Yeah, he'd fought in Mesopotamia. And
Yeah.
I gather kind of partly been radicalised by how useless he thought the British High Command were there.
He was involved in the Kilmichael ambush, in which 17 auxiliaries.
Which is the worst military defeat the British suffer in the war, I think.
Yes, and then a month later, there's another auxiliary killed at Dillon's Cross in Cork. In response to that, signed off on, British forces go in and they burn down the City Hall and they burn down the Carnegie Library. So they're the kind of the high point reprisals. They're the ones that really stand out. But all across the country were small scale reprisals, like attacks on private property, on livestock, on creameries. Creameries matter so much across rural Ireland. Foundation of the economy there. And you can see Crown forces who were bored, or they're untrained or unable to cope with this guerrilla warfare. And they felt they were losing.
But what's happening is that the war is becoming nastier, I guess. A lot of people are dying. There's a sense of possibly brutalisation on both sides. Like Bloody Sunday, all of this is a terrible propaganda disaster for the British. So abroad, people look at the burning of Cork or the stories of the reprisals or the story of the shootings at Croke Park, and they say, oh, the British are completely out of control, they're behaving incredibly badly and all of this kind of thing. So Britain has lost the battle for worldwide public opinion at this stage. And yet, paradoxically, is there an argument that on the ground, the British have actually stabilised the situation to some degree, in that they are now fighting back much harder against the IRA? And it's the IRA that are on the ropes in 1920. What are we, 1920 going into 1921?
Into 21. So the war was changing and the IRA was having trouble getting money and getting arms in. So it's reckoned that there were about 5,000 people in the IRA by May 1921, that they had maybe 3,000 rifles, maybe almost 5,000 revolvers, but ammunition was really hard to come by. That being said, their targeted attacks were causing a lot of death. I mean, we're going to talk about a truce that comes in the middle of July, but in the 10 days before that truce, 17 policemen were killed. So there was still capacity on the IRA side. But against that, the government is really going after hard reprisals in response to specific incidents. They don't really have a policy though. They don't know how they're going to get this to end. They can't win this militarily unless they go in and raise the place. And we've mentioned this already. They couldn't do that.
It's a public opinion.
But I also think it's a matter of capacity because it would have cost a lot of money and they would have had to send in a lot of troops for a very long time.
Isn't it the case that the IRA High Command are starting to think that they are losing as well? That both sides think they're losing?
I think it's a stalemate, Tom. I think it's got into this grim, gruesome dance of death where, you know, they're locked in an embrace from which neither can escape, but neither can really control what's happening.
So a good example of that is the Customs House attack, right? So the Customs House here in Dublin, that's May 1921. And it looks like a great propaganda victory for the IRA. They attack this sort of symbol of British power, but they lose an awful lot of men doing it, don't they? I mean, something like 100 of them captured, something like that.
Oh yeah, it's a disaster for the IRA, who go in to do what they said they would never do, which is another set piece engagement. Everything was to be guerrilla warfare. So they go in, they burn the Customs House, and they lose men and guns, which they cannot afford to do. That in itself is a bad, bad blow to the prestige of the IRA in all of that. And it's hard to say that they were about to be destroyed or they were about to lose or that they felt they were going to lose. There was no sense that this was going to end in a military victory for either side. It just did not seem that the capacity was there for either side. It certainly wasn't there for the IRA to militarily defeat the British. What they had done, though, was destroy the legitimacy of the British state around huge swathes of the country and had left a state that was dependent on reprisal and violence.
And is that the feeling increasingly throughout the early months of 1921 in London as well? That the legitimacy of British rule is crumbling and that therefore a new policy is needed, maybe one that's not based on reprisal and force?
Well, you can see the first tentative attempts to broker a solution actually began at the end of 1920 when there was a rejuvenate or a kind of a reframing of the British administration in Dublin, and Lloyd George put over people like Andy Cope and Sir John Anderson and came over and they tried to kind of reformulate policy within the organisation. And there were kind of tentative connections through a Republican businessman called Patrick Moylett as a go-between both sides. It foundered not least because of Bloody Sunday, those initial attempts. And then the Archbishop of Perth, a man called Patrick Clune, who was actually the uncle of Conor Clune, who'd been shot in Dublin Castle earlier. He tried to broker a deal and that didn't work at all. And then there were various writers such as Lady Greenwood and others who tried to get involved. But there is a circumstance which permitted for truce. And that was the actual enactment of the Government of Ireland Act had come in 1920. In June of 1921, that's open. And King George V goes over and makes a speech.
So he goes to Belfast, doesn't he, to open the new Northern Ireland Parliament. As you said last time, the supreme irony that the Ulster Unionists, who had been the most bitter, implacable opponents of Home Rule, now have their own Home Rule Parliament. And he opens it and he gives this speech written for him by South African leader Jan Smuts and approved by David Lloyd George. And George V calls for an end to strife in Ireland, and he says, "I'd like all Irishmen to pause, stretch out the hand of forbearance and conciliation, forgive and forget, and join in making for the land which they love a new era of peace, contentment and goodwill." And this is perceived as an olive branch from, of all people, the king, sort of saying, okay, it's gone too far. Now is the time to put down the guns.
And the king he'd been appalled by the Black and Tans, I gather.
Yes, and really useful to Lloyd George, and it gave him a certain amount of cover because there were people still within the cabinet who were like, we're not negotiating. These are gunmen. These are a rabble. This isn't a nation. These are people who have no right to sit at the same table as us, but the feelings are going out. And there's press coming from within London to resolve this. that this is interminable.
But can I just ask about the speech that George V gives in Belfast? Is there a sense that he needs to give that speech to establish the legitimacy of what will become, I suppose, the outpost of the United Kingdom in Northern Ireland before entering into negotiations with the Republicans?
That's exactly right. That's the key thing in that whole thing. You can now talk about a discussion about what to do with Ireland because you've fixed up the Ulster Unionist problem.
It's a bridgehead that they want to keep.
It allows, and in any negotiation, a British government to say, well, anything we're discussing, we'll discuss all of Ireland, but this actual parliament is in place already and operational for these 6 counties, which are now going to be called, or will in the future be called, Northern Ireland.
And are they doing that because they want to keep that as part of their negotiations? Or are they already thinking, you know, we could keep this as a base from which to prosecute the war if it goes on?
Oh, I don't think it's about the prosecution of war. I do think it's about the negotiations that are coming. There's a brilliant book by Ronan Fanning called Fatal Path, which it's a brilliantly told story, exactly what happened here within British politics, how the truce and then the treaty are constructed, but extending back to 1910, takes it all through brilliantly. Just an incredibly well-written book.
And let's get to July 1921, a few weeks later. Eamon de Valera has returned from the United States. So we now have the first meetings between de Valera and Lloyd George, and they are aimed at, you know, can we get a truce and can we get a some kind of forum where we'll strike a deal?
So there's a truce agreed for the 11th of July, 1921. And in respect of that truce, there is basically the idea there will be no violence on either side on that. And in the wake of that, David Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, Eamon de Valera, as President of the Irish Republic, there are 4 meetings and about 50 letters shared between them. And the idea is that they will find a basis for the establishment of negotiations, which might lead to a treaty.
Kind of vague.
Yes, and eventually on the 30th of November, and I know you're going to talk about the treaty in the next episode, but what was agreed was that a team of Irish negotiators would go to London and that there would be negotiations with His Majesty's government, and I quote, with a view to ascertaining how the association of Ireland with the community of nations known as the British Empire may be best reconciled with Irish national aspirations.
This is where de Valera's command of maths is
deeply involved in it. But you have to think about this. It is absolutely extraordinary that such a negotiation should be about to take place with a group who now represent a part of the Irish tradition, which was utterly marginal in very many respects in 1914 when the Home Rule Bill had been enacted, although had not become operational.
So can I ask a very simplistic question? What's the simplest explanation for how we got from there in 1914 to where we are now in 1921? Is the key factor the First World War, do you think?
I do. I think without the context of war, which truly changed the possibilities for armed rebellion based on the fact that there were guns in the country. Really, though, I think the radicalization process was made entirely possible, facilitated and kicked on in large measure by the militarization through the UVF and their gun running activities. I think that was transformative of the situation because it gave the context in which the Irish volunteers could be formed, which could then split in the context of war, which can then gather momentum through the opportunity to hold a rising, to redeem for a generation the idea that there would be an Irish rebellion and rejection of the state. And from that moment on, things truly changed.
And Paul, can I ask, I'm sure it's an unanswerable question, but suppose the First World War hadn't happened. Suppose Home Rule is introduced. Do you think there would still have been an Irish Revolution? Would the impetus for Ireland to leave the United Kingdom full stop have continued, or
would we have become Wales or Scotland?
Yes.
I think that's a great question. It's obviously, as you said yourself, an unanswerable question on it. There's a brilliant article in a book called Virtual History by Alvin Jackson, which deals with that particular question. And I would urge people to read that article. What I will say is that there were a group of people who were unreconciled to the idea of Home Rule being enough. They were not going to stop at Home Rule being enacted. Now, whether that Home Rule Parliament would have become in itself the means to achieve a greater freedom, or it would have been...
So the freedom to win freedom, as Collins will put it.
Would it be that, or would it be the block on the achievement of freedom is the great unknowable?
Yeah, would it be the Scottish Parliament or the Catalan Parliament?
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. So the truce has been agreed. The negotiations will begin, and the next time on The Rest is History, we will return with the Irish negotiating team to London to tell that extraordinary story. Some amazing characters: David Lloyd George, Winston Churchill, Michael Collins, of course, and offstage the long shadow of Eamon de Valera.
Very long.
And spoiler alert, they will not get the peace they are hoping for. They will find themselves embarking on a bitter and bloody civil war. But Paul, we should give you a massive round of applause at the end of that episode, because you've done 3 episodes in one day.
Yeah.
A Herculean achievement. We are enormously indebted to you, as ever. The Rest is History. And we're indebted to the staff here at Croke Park for hosting us. And thank you so much for setting it all up.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. It's an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much, Paul. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.